everyone, welcome back. Today we are talking all about worms. So we're going to talk about earthworms and composting worms and what the differences are and how you can use them to support your gardening system. We're going to talk about why worms are so important for an ecological farming system. They're the foundation of all health in the system. If you just want to know about how to set up a free-range composting worm farm, jump ahead to the chapter about that and you'll be all sorted. Let's talk about why worms are so important to all farming systems. They cycle nutrients. That's the main thing that they do. So they take decomposing organic matter and turn it into a form that plants can uptake and keep growing and make that cycle happen. The plants take up the nutrients, grow into plants, die, return to decomposing organic matter, and the worms help to cycle that all through the system. So they're super important for that. And both earthworms and composting worms do that same job of cycling that organic matter through the system. Earthworms are the worms that live in the soil. They travel up and down through the layers of the soil. Depending on what species they are, they go a bigger or a shorter distance, but they're really important to the soil health of the whole environment. So what earthworms do is they improve soil health and plant health by making their burrows through the ground, which helps air and water into the soil profile, and they move from the bottom to the top layers and the top to the bottom layers of the soil. So they move the minerals in the soil up through all those layers to help mix all of that together. So it really, over time, helps your soil to become just a vibrant, wonderful environment for all the plants and animals and all those microbes that live there to be really healthy. One really magical thing that earthworms do is they help improve the actual structure of the soil. So as they move the soil through their bodies and out the other side as worm castings or worm poop, all of those materials there that go through the worm and out the other side have compounds that help the particles of the soil clop together, which is called soil aggregation. So the structure, how the soil feels and behaves and holds water, all works together much better when you have lots of earthworms present. Composting worms work in the top layer, the organic matter layer of the soil, and they don't really go much further than just the first couple of centimeters at most of the actual soil itself. And their job is to rapidly break down all the dead things that drop onto the ground and turn it back into plant available nutrients. And they're really helpful for that because you can harness them to work for you a little bit more easily than you can with earthworms. How do you support your earthworm populations? Well, there are some things you can do that help your worms, and they also help lots of other things in your farming system. The first thing to do is to make sure your earthworms have lots of food. Now, the easiest thing to do there in a backyard context is to leave lots of organic matter laying on the ground so it can go back into the soil. So that is things like leaving your grass clippings on the lawn when you mow is really helpful for earthworm health. When your trees drop their leaves in the autumn, leave those leaves, as many as you're comfortable leaving, on the ground to decompose back into the soil. It's good for the soil and it feeds your worms. Having living plants, as many as possible, in your landscape really helps worm health. The roots of the plants feed the soil microbiology, which helps to feed the worms, and it gives the worms places to move and hide all amongst those plant roots. And at the same time as the plants are feeding the soil, the worms are feeding the plants. Earthworms really need shelter and protection when they come up to the surface. So having places for them to hide from their predators allows them to come up to the surface safely, to deposit their deeper soil layers to the top and to eat that organic matter and take it down. So living plants, mulches, wood chips, straw laid on the ground in places for them, like bits of wood or logs, all gives them a place to come up and hide and also be working hard on all of that beautiful soil health. Now, if you've been doing all of these things to help your earthworm population, you really want to be careful to make sure they can stay alive. And what I mean by that is avoiding using things that will kill them. Those are things like using herbicides, insecticides, and fungicides on your property will negatively impact earthworm health. And using things like mechanical tilling, like a rototiller, essentially just pulverizes them in that area. So trying to avoid using those pesticides as much as possible, finding other ways to manage pests in your environment is really important, and using minimum tillage practices really helps earthworm populations to be supported. Here I am at my composting worm farm, free range. The worms can come in and out as they want to. I put this together heading into winter last year, and it's been a great little setup here. So what I've got going on is just a wooden frame with the mesh on the top, which is to keep the chickens out. Then underneath that is a layer of cardboard to keep it dark and to keep moisture in for the worms. And then under here, we just have a pile of all sorts of organic matter. What I used to start off the worm farm was a lot of horse manure, and I find that horse manure is the best thing for composting worms. They love it. It both feeds them and provides the bedding which they need to live in. So if you can find horse manure, I would highly recommend using that to start your system. Now, if you can't use horse manure because you can't find any, worms need a combination of a bedding material and then of course they need their food. So bedding material can be shredded up cardboard. Worms love cardboard. It can be like straw, shredded paper, things like that to give them a place where they sort of live and move and do all their wormy activities. And then their food is organic material. So that could be your kitchen scraps, weeds from your garden, coffee grounds, things like that they will love to eat. What you want to do is feed them only enough of that organic material that they can consume within sort of a week or so. Everyone has a different take on how much you can feed them, but you don't want to give them so much food that it just sits there and rots before they eat it. So just feel it out, just feed them as much as they can eat in a few days and go from there. Work out how your system is best working for you. Moisture and temperature are very important for your worm's health. So you want to keep them quite damp. They don't like drying out, but equally they don't like to be sopping wet. So that's a little bit of a management. I water the top of the cardboard of my worms every couple of days just to keep them nice and moist in there. And I've got quite a thick layer of material here. So if it starts to dry out at the top, they can just move deeper into their little house here. Also bearing in mind that they can leave this area whenever they please, so it's my job to keep them happy in here, or they will just find a new place to live. Worms also don't like being too hot, so if you've got a very exposed area with lots of sunlight, it's probably not the best place to put your worm farm. This little worm farm that I have happening here will need to move now that we're moving into summertime, so I'm going to do that pretty soon to give them a more shady spot over the hot season. So what do you do when you want to actually use the compost that your worms have been making for you? Well, in a system like this, what I do is I get the cardboard and I cover one side of the area, so they've got their nice shelter here, and I'll feed them some food under the cardboard. What they're going to do is they're going to move from the exposed side into the covered side, and there's going to be very few worms left in this area, and I can just dig that out and go and take it to the garden where I want to use it. Often, if I just need a small amount to help inoculate some good microbiology into my garden, I'll just scoop it out, worms and all, and take it to the garden bed. And they're going to be totally fine with that because I keep lots of mulch and like weeds and bits and pieces decomposing on the surface of my garden, so they've got food and shelter and they're perfectly happy, and it helps my garden health if they set up to live in there too. My system here is just a cover with some horse manure and organic materials in a pile on a ground, and that is all my worm farm is. Now, there's all sorts of ways you can set it up. You could use a half barrel, like plastic barrel with holes drilled in the bottom, and fill that up so they can move in and out through the holes. If you just want a really simple system and you're not too concerned about getting lots of compost out of it, you can get a bucket, drill holes in the bucket for the worms to get in and out, and bury it in your garden. Where do you get your worms from to start your composting system? Well, I've never had to buy any. They've just always shown up. So when I initially got my start in worm farming, I had a compost bin just sitting outside the house that I was filling up, and one day I went and had a look and it was full of little red wiggly composting worms. Now, that's not an easy bin to harvest from, so I don't tend to harvest out of that. I use that composting bin sort of as a worm nursery. So I move the worms from there out to other places that I want to set up a composting system. If you don't want to wait for the worms to show up into your system, or if they don't show up, you can just buy them from a garden center or online. Somewhere around you, someone will be selling composting worms that you can buy to get your system started. Those are my hows and whys for free-range worm farming. I would love to hear any of your questions or comments. I hope you found this interesting. Thanks for watching.